So this is the speech that the prophet gives. This is what you can expect from a human king. He will separate your families, taking your sons from you and forcing them to fight in his armies. He will force your sons into labor on his own farms and set them to work in his armaments factories. He will take your daughters from you and turn them into his slaves. He will take the best of your crop-yielding farms, the best of your olive groves and vineyards, and give them as rewards to his deputies and those who loyally serve him. Is this sounding at all familiar? He will tax the fruit of your labors, your wine and grain, and will supply the revenue to his officers and servants. He will take your young men, your male and female servants, and your donkeys, and put them to work on his own properties. He will tax your livestock and reduce you to a life of servitude. On that day, you will cry out to Yahweh for mercy, and he will not hear you. Well, you don't need a PhD to realize it's the same thing. It's the same thing that Yahweh is describing. These modalities of colonization and dominance are ages old, older than the British Empire, the Dutch, the Spanish, the Portuguese, the Roman, the Mongol Empire. These have been the methods and modalities of colonization since the year dot. And Yahweh knows these methods from the inside out. And indeed, as we go through the pages of the Hebrew canon, we find these patterns repeating in his own governance over his people. Now that pivot, when the people say, we don't want direct rule from Yahweh anymore, we want to be led by one of our own, is a pivot that occurs in a whole canon of stories that span the globe, a canon of stories that we could identify as dragon stories. So many cultures have dragon stories. You've got the Colchis from Georgia, the Coca from Spain and Portugal. You've got the Kuchedra and the Akuchu from Japan. You've got Quetzalcoatl, Cucumats, Kukulkan from Mesoamerica. Dragon stories around the world follow a similar pattern. It begins with human colonies governed over by a dragon, and the dragon will dominate them with fear and terror. And anyone who stands up to the dragon is made an example of, by which I mean a very violent execution. And the dragon taxes them. Dragon wants beef, lamb, gold, virgin girls, and everybody finds that they're really living a life of servitude towards the dragon. Everything has changed since the dragon showed up. Well, things carry on like this for generations and generations, and then a pivot arrives. And the pivot takes a couple of forms. Either a prince arises who, for some reason, is just not scared of the dragon and confronts it and kills it. And so St. George would be an example of that kind of story, St. George and the dragon, or Daniel in the Bible, in Bel and the Dragon, which is in the Deuterocanonical books, the Greek translation of the Old Testament. There you've got a hero who stands up, confronts the dragon. And it's such an ancient story, has been going for so long, that by the time we get to the story of Beowulf, which is, what, the 6th century that originates, the writer of Beowulf is already beginning to change and subvert and adapt the story because the standard story is so well known. But the other version of the story is the version we find in the Hebrew canon. And that is where the people have been terrorized by fiery destruction and exploitation for so long that they move from a place of subjection and depression to a place of anger. They are just not prepared to live this way any longer. How dare the dragon subject them to a life like this? There's this emotional switch that turns. And it's as if the dragon has been using the same old terrorizing practices for so long that you can't be frightened of them anymore. And that people have reached the point of saying, well, what can he do? He can only kill us. And somehow that's not so terrorizing anymore. And so the people come together and they realize if we confront the dragon with one voice, if we confront the dragon in solidarity, then the dragon can't govern anymore. If it's just one person at a time saying, I don't want to work for you anymore, the dragon can pick us off one by one. But what's it going to do? Kill us all? What's the point of that? Won't have any servants or slaves if it kills us all. And so the people come together, they confront the dragon together. We're not frightened of you anymore. We've had enough. We're not going to work for you anymore. And when the dragon sees that the mathematics has changed, he's killed one and now 1,000 have stood up, dragon gives up and often just slinks away to the mountains to live out its existence in lonely solitude. Now that's really a story of social progress and social development, of people discovering one another, people discovering the power of organization, the power of solidarity, and realizing that when they reject fear and allow their love and solidarity to confront the despot can no longer govern. And I'm old enough to have seen the dragon story play out many times in real world history, in our geopolitics. So I think about what happened with the Marcos, the first Marcos regime, I should now say, in the Philippines, where people have been exploited and terrorized for so long that the terror lost its power to paralyze. And the people stood up and the Marcos regime could tell they no longer had purchase over the population. Very similar to what happened in Romania, where Nicolae and Alina Ceausescu were standing in front of the crowd trying to pacify them. And we watched this in real time. We watched their reaction as they realized these people have no respect for us anymore. We have no authority standing in front of this crowd. And well, it was only a matter of hours later that the regime was over and the lives of the Ceausescus was over. South Africa, an amazing example of people coming together all around the world to say enough is enough with apartheid. And the struggle against apartheid had been really symbolized in the South African regime's treatment of Nelson Mandela, and a worldwide campaign of people standing up saying, no, you can't treat my brother that way. And we saw things change. I can remember his walk to freedom when he was finally released, and it was an incredibly moving experience. At a similar time, this was only months apart, that we saw the soldiers who manned the border between the East and West simply stop taking action because people crossing the border had just reached a proportion where the mathematics no longer worked. It just wasn't worth trying to stop them. And once people realized they'd stopped policing the border, it was only hours later that the Berlin Wall was being literally shaken and torn apart and came down. These are incredible moments. I'm so glad they're caught on camera because they are reminders that things can change. Other ways are possible. And things that seemed immovable, the behemoths and dragons of our time, are not immovable when we are willing to find each other, reject fear, and to learn how to speak with one voice, learn how to speak together and pull together for the common good. It still has the same power that it always did. And that's what our ancestors wanted to tell us when they shared these stories. They didn't tell these stories of colonization in the world of paleo-contact just to tell us how awful it was, but to show us that other ways are possible, and this is how things changed. But all these lessons in social progress evaporate the moment you translate Yahweh as God. And the moment you translate Elohim as God, once you make that translation, you have to accept whatever the God character does in the pages of the Bible without question. And it frames the idea of what is good and what is bad in a really paralyzing way. What is good is following orders, whether they make sense or not. And well, we've already had a 20th century to show where that kind of thinking leads. When we read through the stories of Yahweh, we find that he uses all the methods and means that his prophet Eli enumerated in that speech. And when the kings who come after him start doing things he disapproves of, he takes punitive action. And it seems whether you're a citizen or you're a king, you're not allowed to think for yourself. And that's how things play out. I'll come back to that in a little while. But when we read these stories as God stories, we are not allowed to evaluate what the Yahweh character is doing, and we lose our moral compass, and we lose our political compass as a consequence, because we just have to accept what comes from God and what comes from the higher ups. There are layers and layers of political education in the Hebrew scriptures and in many other narratives around the world, which are clear as day when we read these as stories of colonization by ET visitors, when we read them as stories of paleo-contact, read them as God stories. There's no moral of the story. You just do what you're told. So let me go to another political lesson that is hidden in the Bible by these mistranslations. Growing up in Great Britain, I was mystified really by how things worked, because I was told that Britain was a democracy. Technically, my educator said, we're a constitutional monarchy, but the powers of the monarchy are really just symbolic. They're really just ceremonial. In working practice, we're a democracy. Well, that certainly should have been the case. I mean, after all, it was 1215, long time ago, that the Magna Carta was signed, when the barons found that if they acted with solidarity, they could curtail the powers of their king, and they could bring in a rule of law and a Bill of Rights instead of absolute crown power. Huge change in 1215. And then in 1649, they decided to get rid of the king altogether. King Charles I was executed, and a bill was passed through Parliament to abolish the office of king. In 1660, they changed their mind, and a new king was appointed, albeit with curtailed powers. And then in 1688, there was something called the Glorious Revolution to curtail the powers of the crown even further, so that the country would now be governed by Parliament, with many of the crown's powers devolved to Parliament. And then there were huge social shifts. I mean, the 1800s, voting was extended from the nobility, who are all in the same boat, so to speak, to the common man. And it was the common man. Only males were allowed to vote, adult males. And those reforms came in the 1800s. We had to wait till the 1900s before the voting franchise was extended to adult females. But now we've got something that looks like a democracy. And then in the 1900s, we had the labor movement, which produced new generations of leaders whose whole purpose was to contend for public policy that would serve the common good instead of the good of the 1%. In effect, shifting from a pattern of $1 one vote to one person, one vote. These huge seismic shifts. And yet, how much was really changed? Again, I'll just read from a paragraph from the upcoming book. People often assume that after all these changes, crown powers really are no more than ceremonial and have no real purchase in 21st century politics. Except, in my lifetime, And in recent years, we've seen these powers used by the Crown to amend legislation, to avoid legal scrutiny, to shut down successive police investigations into elite crime, and to depose a democratically elected Prime Minister on the other side of the world in Australia. These powers are far from ceremonial. They represent a hidden hand in the political operations of what looks on the surface like a democracy. And indeed, after all those changes, the British Prime Minister can't form a government until the King gives him permission. And all through the Prime Minister's tenure, he will have to report to the King every week on what he's doing. No one is allowed to be a member of Parliament until they've sworn an oath of allegiance to the Crown, so on and so forth. And you might think, well, how is this possible? After all those revolutionary changes. Jeremy Paxman, who anchored the BBC's Newsnight for 25 years, asks what's potentially an even more probing question. After all those huge social changes, a civil war, revolution, abolition of the monarchy, so on and so forth, that it's still the same 5 families running Britain as 500 years ago. How is that possible? Well, the answer is many layered, but I'm going to mention a couple of layers here. Vested objects and covert government. I'll start with vested objects, which I think is a rather fun subject, a rabbit hole I'm enjoying exploring. And it's quite topical because last month, Ian Hamilton died at the ripe old age of 97. He was a QC, which is a senior judge, legal advisor to the Crown, and he was a senior criminal lawyer in Scotland for decades, very well respected. And all the press have talked about his death. A movie's already been made about his life. And you're sitting there thinking, Ian Hamilton, I've never heard of him. Why are they making a movie about some criminal lawyer in Scotland? Why would Robert Carlyle accept that part? That doesn't sound very Oscar-worthy. Well, the answer is to do with something that happened in 1950. In 1950, Ian Hamilton was an eager young student of law at Glasgow University. And he found 3 friends to make a trip down to London. And he rode down to London on his motorcycle, I believe it was. And when they reached Westminster Abbey, they took a crowbar, pried the door open, crept into the dark building, because it's the middle of the night, and lifted 336 pounds, that's 152 kilos, of sandstone, which they then drove at breakneck speed and with police pursuing all the way back to Scotland. And once safely over the border, they deposited it at Arbroath Abbey. The arrival of the stone in Scotland was greeted with celebrations in the streets. And there was a real atmosphere of festival around this sandstone. Meanwhile, in Westminster, there were fears of revolution and of Scotland leaving the Union. What on earth was all that about? Well, Ian Hamilton later commented on it, and he said this, and I'll do my best Scottish. Independence is now inevitable. The stone transcends politics. Regardless of our political views, Scots recognise there is something that binds us together. What was it all about? That 336-pound block of sandstone is what I call a vested object. It's called the Stone of Scone, or the Stone of Destiny. And prior to 1296, when it was taken from Scotland and brought down to Westminster, It was the stone used for the coronation of Scottish kings. And since arriving in England in 1296, it's been used for the coronation of all the English sovereigns from that time to this. And why did they put it in the sanctuary of Arbroath Abbey? Because that's where the Scottish barons came together and signed the Declaration of Scottish Independence back in the 1300s. The stone is a vested object. It represents the right to rule over Scottish lands. That's why the English wanted it, and why the English wanted it back, and why the Scots wanted it back. That's why this very honorable man who has just passed away as a QC and a senior criminal lawyer risked his freedom and his entire career to bring that stone back to Scotland. It represents Scottish sovereignty. So that's a vested object, a thing that carries within it authority and power, often because that has been vested upon it, projected upon it. A crown is a vested object, an orb, a scepter. These are vested objects. We'll be seeing these, of course, in the months to come on the TV. The gold in the crown, the diamond from this colony, the opal from this colony, the sapphire from this colony, all embedded in the crown, represent the right to rule over those places. It's quite telling to look at portraits of George Washington made during his lifetime and shortly thereafter, and to compare them with the portraits of King George III. King George III, of course, was the King of America before George Washington became the first president. And in the pictures, you will see the same motifs. They look remarkably similar to each other, albeit George looks rather more overweight and less healthy, and George Washington looks a little younger and fitter. But you will find a navy blue coat, a naval hat, golden epaulettes, a staff, a sword, a Roman mace and eagle, which were the symbols of power in the Roman Empire, disguised as a table leg, white powdered wigs, crowns and flags in the background, gold braid and lots of gold. And all those objects are vested with associations of power and authority. And the fact that they're all in the portraits and they're so similar is really a message that though we now have a president and not a king, the president has all the same kinds of power. It's the same kind of power that has passed from the old regime to the new regime. In the Bible, we find vested objects as well. The Ark of the Covenant, containing Aaron's staff. Aaron, the number one officer to Moses, has this staff of office that can do amazing and magical things. And there's a jar of manna that recalls Yahweh's supernatural power to generate food and keep his people alive. There is the Nehushtan, which is the bronze image of the serpent, which the people had to kowtow to because otherwise they'd die, because Yahweh was punishing them for complaining about their emergency rations and being too hungry. And then there's the Urim and the Thummim, which are devices for obtaining guidance from a Yahweh who's no longer on the planet's surface. These are vested objects in the Hebrew stories. They represent the right to rule over the tribes of Israel, which is why enemy powers tried to steal these objects. And so the story is told of what happened to them when they stole our vested objects, and how the totem of their powerful one fell down and broke, and how they all got sick when the vested object was in their community and they had to send it away on a cart carried by 2 oxen so that the tribes of Israel could have their holy objects back. But what's curious about those objects is that they may be the vested objects of a previous civilization. Why do I say that? because it's quite clear that neither they nor the writers of the Hebrew scriptures knew how these objects worked or what they really were. We have details for constructing an ark, and we're told that it's a communications device, but we're not told how it works. We're told that it can create vortices of wind, but we're not sure how. We're told that if you touch it, you'll get electrocuted and die, or if you go near it, you'll get radiation sickness, but we're not sure why. We're told that the Urim and Thummim can be used for getting some kind of guidance, some kind of remote communication going with Yahweh, but we're not told how. And I would suggest that this is because those who came before knew how to operate those things, whether we're talking about a previous human civilization or the ET visitors who instituted the practices surrounding these objects. So the objects remain, they still hold their association with power, but no one quite knows how they work anymore. So we have these objects that symbolize the passage of power. So presumably Yahweh hands over things to his successor when he's deposed, and King Saul has them. Saul now has the power, right? And then when Saul commits suicide, his successor David now has the power, right? And the kings have the power. Is that right? Not right. When Saul does something that Yahweh would not have done, and what it was is he waged war more mercifully than Yahweh would have waged it. He wins the battle. He defeats the military. What Yahweh would have done was to kill every man, woman, child, and animal and leave only scorched earth. And when Yahweh sees that Saul is running things differently, he deposes Saul. And if that weren't bad enough, he infests him with some kind of archonic entity to make him mentally ill and drive him to suicide. And then he's replaced by David, who, as we know, was somebody quite happy to use murder for his own personal pleasure. A man after my own heart, says Yahweh, until David does something Yahweh doesn't like.